Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 152 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. And Gavin, have you ever had something break on you at the last minute?
I sure have.
Yep, that's what happened to me just now.
Yep, Mike's mic just happened to kind of crap the bed,
Got
basically
a nice
right.
fraying wire.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right as we clicked record. So if Mike
hell yeah.
if Mike sounds a little different this episode, that's why.
And I'll tell you what, I don't apologize. I don't care at all.
Yeah,
You're gonna hear my raw, unvarnished voice, maybe a little bit of echo in the background from my laptop mic, and you're gonna like it.
or at the very least, I'll do my best in post to try and mitigate some of it. But echo is a notoriously hard thing to get rid of.
Yeah, you have fun with that one.
Yeah. Also, Fia is not with us today. She's taken a little hiatus, but hopefully will be back with us next time. And oh boy, there's a whole bunch of things going on today.
Like what?
Well, we're recording this on January 20th.
Why is that important?
Well, it's Inauguration Day, Mike. And, it sure is a time, on top of everything else going on in the world. So I have here, just in my notes, just various things to talk about before we get started. So, firstly, the fires over around LA have been a big thing. I personally know many people who've had to evacuate. A couple of my old coworkers from when I used to work in the desert out there. Like a couple of them, I don't think their house fully got, but definitely some of their stuff has been lost. So we'll have some links down in the description for places to donate, including one of the links will be for some organizations that work for better conditions for prisoners. Because if you didn't know, a decent proportion of the people fighting the fires around LA are prisoners who get paid like $6 a day to fight fires and save people's homes. And they don't get any kind of like firefighting certifications or anything when they get released from prison. They often get rejected for jobs as firefighters once they get out because they fail criminal background checks, which I think is pretty messed up. So there'll be some links for organizations fighting for, getting them better conditions as well. I know, given who was just inaugurated, prisoners' rights is not something that's top of mind for most people, or something that the administration is going to be focusing on. But still something to think about. So on top of other links to donate to help people whose houses and stuff have been impacted by fires, there'll be links for that as well. And then one other quick note before we get to today in history, which Mike has told me is a good one.
Just a little chuckle. That's all it's going to be.
Okay. I also decided, as I went through making the outline for this episode, that I'm going to be starting like a new consistent segment on Mike Takes the Wheel or Fia Takes the Wheel episodes, because normally I just kind of do whatever at the beginning, because those aren't my job. But I'm basically going to be doing a quick news highlight for what the administration's been doing in the realms of science from, episode that's not mine to other episode that's not mine. So give or take a couple months in between each of those sort of segments that come up. So mostly because, like I said, this episode really put a lot of things in perspective for me, doing the research for it. And if you're a regular listener to this podcast, I think you probably care about things going on in science. And we also never really had to think too much about this, because we started this pod in the very latest days of Trump's first term. And, by the time we had started it, he had already lost the 2020 election. And I think we were just, I don't want to speak for Mike, but at least I know I was just excited to be moving on from that time.
I was.
Sadly, that's not a luxury we're living under anymore. And so I think it's important, because if this administration is going to be anything like the first one, and by all accounts probably worse, they're just going to flood the zone with so much stuff that a lot of really important things are going to fly under the radar. And so the first of those sort of segments, so like the next Mike Orphea Takes the Wheel episode won't be until the end of February. But I'm basically saying it now to hold myself accountable to it. So because I know if I try to look back at it like the week before that episode, I'm going to miss stuff. So basically this is a signal to myself, telling myself to, hey, keep track, week by week what they're doing so that I can talk about it.
This is the first time hearing of that, but I am looking forward to that. I wouldn't be opposed to making it a more every episode kind of thing, but at the very least, every 5 to 10.
Yeah.
Sign me up for that.
Yeah, and like we'll see. If there are like very important things that come up, I'll talk about them. But I feel like it's gonna be a lot toward the beginning, just like any administration. Like they get a lot of things done, or at least try to do a lot of things right at the beginning, and then things slow down once you get closer to midterms and stuff like that. So probably not sustainable to be doing this every episode. There probably just won't be enough stuff. But we'll see. We'll see how things go.
Boy, you want to talk about famous last words?
Yeah, you are so right, bestie.
All right, you want to have any more housekeeping? Do you know what we're doing next episode? Any other stuff people can like, comment, and other whatevers?
Yeah, this is a very relaxed episode, if you couldn't tell. And by relaxed, I mean incredibly anxious. So next episode, we're actually going to be talking about this topic again, because this is the longest outline I've ever done for an episode of the pod, coming in at about 10 pages. Most of our episodes are about 5, maybe 6 for long ones. So we're splitting this into 2 parts. Next episode will be part 2 of the Scopes trial, which we're talking about today. But before we get into that, Mike, give us a quick little chuckle before we get mad and look back at history.
So, today in history, I'm going to pull it up here, but it was in 1973. You actually had Roe v. Wade come down, which was I thought was interesting. That's not the one that I thought was funny. But yeah, like Roe v. Wade happened. Like that's a cool thing.
In January?
Yeah, January 1973, January 22nd.
Huh.
Yeah. The other one was in 1852. This website that I use. The big headline is just England and France declare war.
Cool.
Which
one?
Yeah, exactly. That's that's what I want to. The subheading: England and France declare war on Emperor Charles V. I don't know anything about it. I'm not going to look into it. I just thought it was funny that it's something so generic as England and France declare war.
To me,
we're just left to figure out.
That sounds like they're teaming up to declare war on somebody else, because Emperor doesn't sound like an English or French.
Do you really want me to look into this?
Not really.
All right. Emperor, I'm looking into it. Charles V. So the profession, Holy Roman Emperor. Did they go to war against the Holy? I don't. You know what?
You're a U.S. history teacher. That's.
It is startling how little I know about the world before the United States comes on the scene.
Well, that was after the United States came on the scene, but I take
1852 or 1828. Pardon me. Yep. Or pardon me, 1528.
Oh, okay. I definitely you might have said 18.
I probably did.
So it's
It's also startling how little I know about math.
So it's 1523?
1528.
1528. Okay. Interesting. Yep. Okay. That makes more sense.
Makes significantly more sense from a timeline point of view. All right. Gavin, tell us some I don't know, some dead guy stuff.
So today I'm taking a little bit of a page out of Mike Takes the Wheel, because we're not talking about any group of animals or plants or a different, geologic time period. We're talking about a legal case in American history.
Sounds boring as hell.
There's gonna be times where this is gonna be a little dry, but I tried to present it in as much of a story sort of format as I could. And so this case, formerly called State versus Scopes, but you'll often see it just called the Scopes trial or the Scopes monkey trial. And as I did the research for this episode, I realized this whole episode should actually be called Time is a Flat Circle. Because as I did more and more research, I wanted to rip my hair out with how similar a lot of the themes from this trial and this time are to today. Fortunately, I am bald, so no hair was ripped. And so this is potentially rather controversial topic, but given that the Department of Education, or the future of the Department of Education, and the, I'm not joking, CEO of the WWE, who's going to be running it, that's not a joke, look it up, Trump nominated the CEO of the World Wrestling Entertainment to be the Secretary of Education.
Is she the CEO now?
Yes, not a joke. That's where we're at in the world. But also, as I mentioned to Mike before this, I learned so much U.S. history from doing the research for this. So, Mike, if I say anything at any point that doesn't sound quite right or you want to contextualize, please chime in.
The thing is with this, or really any topic when you're talking about, like me, who's just a high school history teacher,
Right.
like I know a little bit about a lot of things. Like you could call it like a mile wide and an inch deep. But there's only so many things that I like really know in depth. So there's a pretty good chance you're gonna know more than I will on pretty much all this, just because you have like put in the groundwork here, and you've got apparently 10 pages of notes. Um, and I think you already mentioned it that you're splitting this episode up into 2 episodes.
Yeah.
I mean, you feel free to cut that down. If we have to do a 3 or 4 parter here, keep it short and understandable. I support your right to do that.
We'll see how it goes. So I
Okay.
wrote this episode as a single episode, so I don't even know where we're going to be splitting it, if I'm being honest. We'll see. But the reason that this got so long, and the reason why I think that you can, contextualize some things, is that like anything in history, whether it's geologic history or human history, U.S. history, to understand anything happening in a particular moment, you need to understand the context of things that came before and other things happening in the world at that moment.
One could say that if you think you just fell out of a coconut tree, no. You exist in the context of all that came before you.
Yeah,
That one hurt?
that hurt.
That one hurt a little bit?
That hurt a little bit.
You set me up for that one.
I sure did. Anyway, if you've not heard about this trial, it centers around the concept of whether teachers or politicians know what's best to be teaching the youth. And given that Donald Trump has just become our president once again, I figured that this was a pertinent time to talk about this trial, especially given that the way he and several of the other high-ranking people in positions around him often speak about the educational system writ large in this country. And so the trial itself takes place in 1925. So this is the 100th anniversary of this trial.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not where I want to start today. There is so much setup that needs to happen for this episode before we actually even get to the trial itself.
Let's do it.
So where I want to start is 66 years prior, in 1859, when Charles Darwin publishes his most famous book, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. That is his most famous book. That's where he describes in great detail his hypothesis for how evolution and natural selection work. As we now know, his ideas were mostly right. Like, he did miss some things. Mainly the actual mechanism for how traits are passed on from parents to offspring, which today we call genetics. That all was being worked out at around the same time period as Darwin was doing his stuff, but over in Austria by a guy you might have heard of called Gregor Mendel with his pea plants. But Darwin didn't know that. He had never read any of Mendel's work. So that's why he still, even by the time he died, I don't think he was ever able to figure out how information is passed from parents to offspring. And I use the word hypothesis, and with Darwin presenting these hypotheses in his books, very intentionally to point out the difference, as we like to do whenever I can, the difference between the scientific use of the word hypothesis and its use in common English. To a scientist, a hypothesis is an explanation for an observation backed up by a lot of supporting data, as opposed to its use in common English, where it basically just means a somewhat educated guess. And I point this out a lot, because at the time, that Darwin's ideas truly were just a hypothesis. But since then, the scientific community has, over and over reaffirmed Darwin's hypothesis so thoroughly that it has become a theory. And
what's the difference, Gavin?
So to a scientist, calling something a theory is basically saying you are as sure as you can be that this explanation is correct. The concept of gravity, for example, is a theory. Plate tectonics is a theory. The existence of atoms is a theory. So, evolution by means of natural selection has just as much supporting data, and in fact, compared to something like gravity, potentially more. There's a lot of things we don't really understand about how gravity works. And so these are just things that we are so confident that we are basically correct about that we just take them as fact, because that alleviates a lot of extra legwork. For example, whenever you talk about evolution or natural selection in a scientific paper, you do not need to cite Darwin every time anymore, because we just take it as we all agree that this is true, that this is as close to a true fact as we can scientifically, be confident in.
Mm-hmm.
And so, while the scientific community generally came to accept the validity of Darwin's hypothesis fairly quickly, it wasn't until the beginning of the 1900s, so about 40 years after Darwin published the book, that natural selection started being taught widely in especially school classrooms outside of universities. Universities, took it on fairly quickly. And so this was still fairly controversial when it started making its way out from academia. But at this point, many people still didn't finish high school. And it's not like, we even teach natural selection to third graders today. So most people really weren't learning this stuff. Then, so that's where it's at sort of in the early 1900s. It's like it just started making its way into non-university schools. And even then, most people were not being taught evolution. Just because they either dropped out of school or for various other reasons.
And at what period of time are we talking about again?
Early 1900s by this point.
Okay.
Then we get up to about World War I. So this is 19 teens. And after the war, some feathers started being ruffled between different factions of American Christianity. If you're looking to look more into this, you can Google the fundamentalist modernist controversy. As you might guess by the name, it basically was infighting between different factions of various churches about the role of the Bible in contemporary American life. The fundamentalists advocated for a literal interpretation of the Bible, and the modernists advocated for a view of the Bible that agreed with various scientific findings, as well as just the changing of society more broadly. Does that sound kind of familiar? Time is kind of a flat circle, and this kind of thing is why we learn history. But with this divide in the church, the various parties involved started picking fights in the culture war. Again, time is a flat circle.
How about that?
And pretty early on, the fundamentalists in various elected offices zeroed in on the teaching of evolution in public schools. And this is sort of where the Scopes trial comes in. In 1925, in Tennessee, a fundamentalist elected official named John Washington Butler went to church one day and heard a sermon from his pastor, where the pastor told a story about a local woman who was attending the University of Tennessee. She had been a faithful churchgoer her whole life, but at the university she took a biology course and was exposed to the theory of evolution. And by the time she came home from college, she had become an atheist. This was absolutely disgusting to Butler, this elected official, who had 3 sons who were going through school, and a local public school where evolution was being taught, as he later learned. So he drafted up a bill, which later came to be known as the Butler Act, named after him, that would pass the Tennessee legislature, banning the teaching of human evolution or any content that differed from the biblical book of Genesis, which outlines how the Christian God created the universe, including how God created humans. Now, the way the law was worded is that you could teach evolution of non-humans, and you did not have to, it did not require you to teach the Bible itself.
But if you were going to teach how humans came to be, you had to teach the biblical interpretation of it. Okay.
But, so, yeah, it didn't require you to teach the Bible, but you couldn't teach anything that conflicted with it. So, could you really teach evolution? Like, no. Most people generally said no. And Tennessee was not alone in this. A handful of other states like Arkansas, Mississippi, Kentucky passed similar laws throughout the 1920s. And a handful of other states as well. And these laws caught the attention of a relatively new legal organization, the American Civil Liberties Union, or the
the ACLU.
Yes, still to this day, a very powerful legal advocacy organization.
Mm-hmm.
And the ACLU offered legal services to people wanting to challenge these laws. And shortly after the Butler Act passed in Tennessee, a teacher named John Scopes took them up on that offer. And then this next section of my notes here is called Weird Legal History Time.
Mm-hmm.
For a lot of the country's history, the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights were interpreted as only protecting people from the federal government. Protecting the public from things that the federal government arrested you for, your speech or your religion under the First Amendment. That's what the Constitution and the Bill of Rights was for. However, up until the late 1800s and early 1900s, it was not regularly interpreted as protecting people from their state's government.
Mm-hmm.
For that, you had to look to your state's constitution. So, for example, hypothetically, a state could establish fundamentalist Christianity as the official state religion, and they could hypothetically arrest someone for their religion or speech that was not aligned with that, and it would not have been in violation of the First Amendment, because it wasn't the federal government doing it. Does that sound pretty much correct for your understanding?
That's my broad understanding of it, and then I assume what you have coming up next is how the Bill of Rights gets incorporated into the states.
Yes.
With the 14th Amendment.
Sure does. After the 14th Amendment was ratified during the Civil War, people, including now the ACLU, started to question that. So for anyone not familiar, who's not up on their civics, the 14th Amendment says that, quote, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." Basically, you can't... basically, people interpret this now as saying, yes, the federal Constitution applies to everybody equally. And that states cannot infringe upon your federal rights. However, that still had not been legally tested by the time the Scopes trial rolls around. And the ACLU was one of the major advocacy groups pushing for applying the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause and Due Process Clause, to apply that to states, particularly regarding the First Amendment. The First Amendment is really the ACLU's like whole deal.
That's
That
I don't know about that.
it is one of their main deals.
I'll give you that.
And so there's a lot of weird aspects to how this case actually sort of came together, though. So, the first does not really involve Scopes or the ACLU at all, but instead the state-mandated biology textbook in Tennessee. Biology teachers were legally required to teach from a specific book, just one. This book had a chapter about evolution, including human evolution. So legally, biology teachers were trapped into breaking the law no matter what they did. Either they taught evolution and violated the Butler Act, or they skipped portions of the required material and broke the law that way. The second weird thing is that the law really wasn't being enforced all that much. As with many culture war things, the law was more virtue signaling than it was to actually arrest people for teaching evolution. And third was that the whole trial was sort of orchestrated to begin with. In the small city of Dayton, Tennessee, a city of just over 2,000 people, a local businessman named George Rapelier thought this whole situation, the passage of the Butler Act and various other goings-on in society at the time, could be used to bring publicity and business to the city. He called up the local county superintendent of schools, whose name, funnily enough, was Walter White, as well as a local lawyer named Sue Hicks. And the three men met at a local drugstore that apparently was a place where lots of people had meetings in town. It was much more like almost like a cafe. Drugstores didn't mean the same thing as they do nowadays back at this time. And so people would meet up there and have coffee and discuss the various news of the day. And those three people, plus the drugstore owner, discussed the law. And Rapelier was very much an out-of-towner. He was a modernist Christian from New York, and he thought the law was rather silly, while some of the others were on the fundamentalist side and supported the law. And Rapelier reportedly said, quote, "As it is, the law is not enforced. If you win, it will be enforced. If I win, the law will be repealed. We're game, aren't we?" And so, basically, they cooked up the idea to, have somebody that they knew violate the law because they knew Rapelier was a smart guy. He knew that there was a lot of things that were going to make this trial very special. And so, Mike, do you know what is special about the 1920 census?
What is special about the 1920 census?
Yes.
Oh goodness, I'm not sure. It would have been done, I guess, under the tail end of the Woodrow Wilson administration. I assume there were some new states coming in to the country at the time. But as far as, unless that was the time that we locked in the number of members of the House of Representatives, I don't know. What do you got?
So the 1920 census was the first time in U.S. history where more people lived in cities than lived in the countries.
Oh, okay.
And this for a number of reasons. This shift happened for a lot of reasons. A, like you said, World War I happened. So a lot of people, it's not like we have major ports of entry, in rural areas typically. So when people would come back, a lot of them went home, I'm sure, but just if you come back into a major city, there's a non-zero chance you're going to stay there. That was probably part of it. But among all the other reasons were new technologies were making farming much more efficient. So fewer farmers were needed to produce the same amount of food. We actually started understanding germ theory by this point, and understanding that having horse manure and garbage everywhere in cities was bad. Um, and that, so the cities really started being cleaned up around this time, and just becoming generally better places to live. And they were also becoming electrified far more quickly than rural areas were. So the cities, as still to this day as they're often viewed, were places, if you wanted to be where the new and exciting things are happening, you wanted to be in the cities. And these, like I said, mainly electricity, but also a very new piece of technology that would change the world still to this day, the radio. And that will become important in just a little bit.
Yes, it will.
And so the result of that census showing that more people now lived in cities than in rural areas caused a very large sense of unease in the rural population, as what they considered their lifestyle and values were losing cultural and political power in the country. Time is a flat circle. There are many other cultural factors at play here that we don't really have time to get into, but among them, the resurgence of the KKK all over the country, including in some of these cities, like places. New York had and Long Island had very active KKK chapters, and even far out west to like Oregon and stuff. Because as this was happening, it wasn't just white people moving from these rural areas to these cities. Cities in general becoming much more diverse as black people moved out of the South and became a bigger part of culture more broadly, with things like jazz music and the Harlem Renaissance. Immigration was being highly restricted from countries that were deemed undesirable with the National Origins Act of 1924. When President Calvin Coolidge signed the National Origins Act of 1924, he said, quote, "America must be kept American," unquote.
Just let that one hang there for a minute.
All of that to say, white evangelical Protestants were terrified of losing cultural and political power, and they set about limiting the ways in which they could lose more power. Laws like the Butler Act were a part of that, keeping things that they didn't want taught in schools out of public schools. Time is a flat circle. And so this businessman in Dayton, Tennessee, was savvy enough to understand that all of these things were happening around the country, and to figure out that if they could be the ones to light this particular powder keg, that they could use it to bring publicity to their small city.
Mm-hmm.
And so, one of the gentlemen in this little meeting went to their friend John Scopes to ask if he would be the plaintiff they needed. And in many ways, he was pretty much the perfect candidate for something like this. He was a relative newcomer to Dayton. I think he grew up in Kentucky or somewhere north of Tennessee. He didn't have many strong ties to the community. He didn't have like a family. So if he did go to prison or even just lost his job, he'd be more or less all right. He didn't have people like counting on him.
And by the way, just like to quickly interject here, this is something that happens actually throughout history. Like, this is not the first time something like this has happened, where like some organizations will find a good candidate to basically try and test a law that they don't like. This happened with Plessy versus Ferguson, with Homer Plessy. This happens probably most famously with Rosa Parks.
Yeah.
Like, it was no accident what Rosa Parks was doing. It was not like an out of the blue thing. And she was not the only one to perform an act the way that she did. This is a known tactic to challenge laws that you might not like, is to try and find a very sympathetic defendant. Go make sure you get arrested. Make sure that you there's no reason for anyone to hate you or to say that to demonize you in any way, and you can just focus on the law itself. So
Exactly.
this is not super unusual.
Right. And also, he was, you know, by all accounts, a fairly stand-up guy. You know, he was the high school's football coach. He was an occasional substitute teacher. And he happened to have taught in the biology class for just like a month or so, a handful of weeks. And that the lawyer who was part of this group of guys at the drugstore, named Sue Hicks, he was pretty good friends with Scopes, so he called him up and had him come down to the drugstore to talk to him about this idea. And funnily enough, during the time that Scopes taught biology, he had taught out of the textbooks, but whether or not he actually taught about evolution, he could not recall. But whether he did or didn't, he said that he would be their guy. So with that, Scopes went to some of his students and basically told them to testify against him and say that he had in fact taught evolution. And I think still to this day it's unclear whether he did or didn't. And you know, potential witness tampering, I think, is probably more illegal than violating the Butler Act was, but here we are. And so the ACLU did, in fact, give him his legal representation. And on May 25th, 1925, he was indicted for violating the Butler Act.
Just as he had planned.
Yes. And so this was also just a very different time for law in the United States. Like I said, one of the prosecutors at the start of the trial was one of the guys at the drugstore who cooked up the plan to begin with. The guy who called up Scopes, Sue Hicks, he was one of the prosecutors who, like I said, was also a friend of Scopes. No conflict of interest there, I guess. And then eventually, this case would get so big that the state's attorney general and assistant attorney general would assist the prosecution as well. When you read through this case, though, for the prosecution, you'll mostly hear about one person in particular, named William Jennings Bryan.
That's our guy.
And so, Mike, how familiar are you with William Jennings Bryan?
He gave one of the more famous speeches in American history. He ran for president 3 times.
Sure
to
did.
the point where, like this guy wanted to be president like Mitt Romney bad.
Very bad.
Right. I would say he wanted to be president like Joe Biden bad, but like eventually Joe Biden got there. William Jennings Bryan never got there. He never got elected. He gives one of the more famous speeches in American history. Runs for president a bunch of times, to the point where I think the last time he was running for president, people said, you know, vote for Taft. You can vote for Bryant any other time.
That's a very good slogan.
Yeah. And he was a very religious person.
He was.
He was a very, I don't know if he was Catholic or some other denomination, but he was a very religious man.
Yes. So yeah, like Mike said, he had been a 3-time, and not just like a guy running, he was the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party 3 times. So he had lost to William McKinley who got name dropped in Trump's inauguration speech. In 1890,
We've lost him twice.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. 1896 and 1900, and then lost to William Howard Taft in 1908. He was also the former Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson during his first term in 1912, so right before World War I. He was a major advocate for the recently passed 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. Very, very famous guy at the time. He was a fervent fundamentalist and accepted the offer to help in the trial, despite having not actually tried a case in court in over 30 years. And so, again, to try to drum up publicity, they reached out to this guy and were like, hey, do you want to be part of the prosecution for this? And he was like, hell yeah. So Scopes later would say in a book that once Brian was on board, there was no way that this wasn't going to turn into an absolute circus in the media.
And oh boy, did it.
Yes. And I want to be clear.
But,
Oh, go ahead.
yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, by this point, so William Jennings Bryant is, years past his political career.
Yes.
At this point, my understanding is that he was slowly starting to, lose it may be too strong of a word, but, get old and, begin to, some of his mental faculties may have slowed down. He may have gotten a little senile.
Which, I mean, he wasn't that old at this time. So he was famous in his first few presidential campaigns for being extremely young. He was,
yes,
I want to say, at the time, the youngest major party nominee. Because I think he was just barely old enough. I think he was like 36 in his first bid in 1896 against McKinley.
So I believe you're correct. I think he would have been like one of the youngest elected presidents by the time, if he was elected originally. However, like, he died later on in 1925.
Yes, he did. We'll talk about. But like I said, he was not 70 by this point. I think he was 65.
Yes.
So not that old. But yeah, I want to be clear throughout the rest of this, as well as next episode. I'm really not meaning to super bash William Jennings Bryant, too hard in these episodes. Politically, he and I probably would have agreed on surprisingly a lot. He was very opposed to American imperialism and the hoarding of wealth by elites. He helped pass a very progressive income tax while he was Secretary of State. The wealthy paid a lot more in taxes then under that tax bill than they do today. He helped pass antitrust laws and lowering tariffs. He generally was opposed to war, and he resigned as Secretary of State after the U.S. joined World War I because he thought we should have let Europe handle its own business. He was the only member of that cabinet to vote against joining World War I. And he was like, well, I'm out then, bye. And he resigned. That said, in this particular story, he is something of a villain from the scientific perspective. He really hated the writings of Darwin. And not just because of his fundamentalist faith, but because of how the business world and the eugenics movement had taken to social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was a big thing at the time, with the rich and powerful using, survival of the fittest to justify their vast wealth, and to justify things like the forced sterilization under various eugenics laws all over the country, which absolutely disgusted Brian. Of course, Darwin himself said nothing about anything about the business world or really human society in his books, and that's not what survival of the fittest means. But I digress. Rapelier, the businessman who drummed up this whole idea, did not miss a beat and wrote letters all over the country and even internationally to drum up publicity for the upcoming trial, including writing to the very famous British science fiction author H.G. Wells, who wrote The War of the Worlds, to ask him to be on the defense team. Wells did write back declining the offer, saying that he didn't even have any legal training in England, let alone the United States. So why would I do this?
A fair question.
Yeah, but like I said, this guy, the only goal in Rapelier's mind was to bring people to this town. Eventually, a guy named Clarence Darrow was brought onto the defense team without really consulting the ACLU and arguably without consulting Scopes. Darrow was a very prominent labor lawyer, having represented unions and other progressive causes before this. Darrow was also a very prominent free speech lawyer who, 1 month before this, had successfully argued before the Supreme Court in a very famous case called Gitlow versus New York that established that, yes, the 14th Amendment does apply and provide free speech protection to against state laws. So that Supreme Court case had been decided 1 month before the Scopes trial. And Darrow was also very, very aggressively agnostic. And
Aggressively what?
Agnostic.
Ah.
And was a very bombastic personality by all accounts. The ACLU really did not want him on this case because they actually wanted to debate the law of the case and not just have it be a circus. But Darrow was brought on anyway. So then, we have basically our two main characters on the legal teams. We have William Jennings Bryan on the prosecution and Clarence Darrow on the defense. And with that, our trial sort of starts. When the trial began, it was the first trial in the country to be broadcast nationally over the radio. This was absolutely revolutionary. Courtroom dramas are extraordinarily popular still today. Law and Order has been on TV for 35 years. We eat this stuff up. And so imagine a brand new technology that let the first courtroom drama be possible in the first place. And the drama was centered on current, extremely contentious issue in national politics. If you can, imagine a world before TikTok. That's difficult, I know. Some people experienced that for a few hours the other day. Imagine if the first thing ever on TikTok was the Harvey Weinstein trial, or the Amber Heard Johnny Depp stuff, or any of Donald Trump's various trials. People would have been going out, at this time, people would have been going out and buying radios by the thousands to listen to this trial happen in real time. So while yes, this was just about a small town in Tennessee, but this was being listened to and followed everywhere, all over the country. And even internationally, lots of people in Europe were following this as well.
Right, the means to have this kind of ability to follow trial just didn't exist. Like, if you wanted to find out about something, you'd have to read about it in the paper, sometimes days after it happened, if not much longer than that.
Exactly.
Versus, you were just now have the confluence of technology to make this possible, along with, like a sexy story. You're talking about religion versus science. A debate as old as time is now happening. So you have this confluence of things that makes it a really interesting draw, and you have the technology to actually make it happen.
Right. And so, with all of that, give or take 40 minutes of background, the trial actually starts. And so if you'll remember, the ACLU was the one who originally wanted to do this court case in the first place. And they wanted to, realistically, they wanted to lose the case so that they could appeal it up to the higher courts. If you're successful in a case like this, that typically means that you can't appeal it up. And just a local town judge does not have the authority, typically, to get, enjoin a law for a whole state. And so their strategy at the beginning was basically that the Butler Act infringed upon Scopes' individual liberties and was therefore unconstitutional. And they understood that, this judge, this argument is not about that. This trial is not about that. It's about whether Scope broke the law or not. So they were basically just laying groundwork for a later appeal. However, that quickly changed mostly because of Clarence Darrow, that aggressively agnostic fancy pants lawyer guy. They then shifted to trying to convince the judge and jury that evolution can coexist with the Bible, and they had called 8 different experts to try and testify. Some were biologists, some were, prominent modernist ministers, so people who, like, from the religious community, who were religious experts who were going to argue how the two could coincide. Again, not at all the point of the trial, but that's what Darrow wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, the judge only let one of those 8 experts testify, and the others could only submit written statements. And so if you know anything about the American legal system, you might be thinking, wait, isn't this trial, like I said, about whether Scopes broke the law or not, and not whether the law is valid? Isn't that something that higher courts like Supreme Courts do? You're absolutely right. The judge also made it very clear to the jury that they were not to decide the constitutionality of the law itself, just whether Scopes broke the law or not. But of course, this trial was never really ever going to be about whether he broke the law or not, because the people who set the whole thing up had other plans. And so the judge, named John Ralston, also made some very curious decisions throughout the trial, including opening each day with a rather long prayer session from local ministers, and often quoted the Bible when addressing lawyers and the jury.
How about,
Again, no
choices were made.
Choices were made. Apparently no conflict of interest there. There are a lot of ugly quotes from this trial, mostly revolving around monkeys. That's part of why you'll often see this referred to as the Scopes monkey trial. Also the fact that many people who came to witness the trial brought monkeys. Sure. That's a thing that happened. Because people flocked to this town to see it in person. And so, among some of these ugly quotes, during the proceedings, William Jennings Bryan said it was ridiculous that humans evolved from monkeys and, quote, not even American monkeys, but from old world monkeys, unquote.
I wonder what he means by old world monkeys.
Black people is what I think he means.
Thank you for putting the quiet part out loud.
Yeah, no, there's no being subtle on that. I mean, he was just racist. Like, that's really just what it was.
Yeah.
And so, 6 days into the trial, with most of their witnesses having been barred from testifying, the judge had ruled that all of the defense's testimony regarding the Bible was irrelevant to the case and was stricken from the record. Which, at this point, was their entire argument. And then the next day, on the 7th day of the trial, in a very dramatic move, something that you see in courtroom dramas, Clarence Darrow, the annoying defense lawyer guy, called William Jennings Bryan, the prosecution lawyer, to the stand as a witness.
Yeah, that's one of those things you tend not to see, ever.
No, because it doesn't make sense. And so, he called him to testify as an expert on the Bible, and he sort of quipped to the judge that since all the evolutionist witnesses were deemed irrelevant, he thought maybe this one would count. And for whatever reason, Bryan accepted. And
again, he, a deeply religious man that was nearing the end of his life may not have had all his faculties about them, so you can absolutely imagine why he might be like, yeah, sure, like, I'll talk about the Bible.
Yeah. And so, with that bit of courtroom drama, dear listeners, we're going to leave you on a cliffhanger. So.
Is that what's happened? So we're, like, So this is the part of the stuff that I don't actually know is, what took place at the actual trial. I know the basics of it, but so like, you're not actually going to tell us what William Jennings Bryan actually said?
Oh no, you'll have to wait 2 weeks for that.
All right.
That's paywalled content, baby.
Paywalled content. We haven't made a dime off of this podcast. We've lost money on this podcast.
By paywalled, I mean 2 weeks of your life. That is
join the Patreon if you want to get it early.
The non-existent Patreon.
Yes.
But yeah, so we will pick up with sort of the conclusion of the trial and its aftermath in 2 weeks' time.
All right, but until then, when we get to the conclusion of the Scopes Monkey trial, this has been episode 152 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike. That was Gavin. Hopefully we'll have Fia with us in 2 weeks to learn about the conclusion of this trial. Until then, take care, everybody.
This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Finella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.